fresh behind, but it won't hurt. Again, a speaker that I'm sure many of you know, have heard talk before. It's Geof Mead, well known as the tutor from the CCE at the University of Sussex. And is it still going? Is it
No.
No.
All right, CCE, RIP.
He's particularly interested in his hometown of Brighton. So it's what's under Brighton, basically. Okay, good.
When I showed the programme to a colleague of mine, he said, "We're on 5:05. What did you really do to annoy the organisers?" So 15 years ago, I marked Tony's essay. I think I gave him 58%. He wanted 78. I do a lot of historical walks around Brighton. I'm not a geologist, I'm a geographer, but I've always been interested in how history and geography work together, also with geology. And I did two really interesting walks with the Brighton Hove Geological Society many years ago with John Cooper, and we looked around building stones in Brighton. And then a few years ago with Stuart Elliott, and we walked around and we looked outside Marks and Spencer's and British Home Stores and HSBC and Nat West and the Royal Pavilion. And all of these stones were fantastic, but they were coming from South Africa, they were coming from Norway, they were coming from Italy, at all points around. And I was really interested in what made up Brighton that wasn't imported in the form of kind of retail outlets, the frontings to shops. And I've said to people when we're walking around Brighton about the geology, people say, how can you study geology in Brighton? It's all roads, it's all buildings. And I said, well, it's there. You just have to do a bit of legwork and you have to do the finger work going through documents and putting these things together. So what I want to look at just at the end here is just to really think about where you can get sources, where are your sources for the built environment. So this is taken from one of the big blocks of flats over on the east side of Brighton, over on the Albion Hill area, looking down over the North Lane. And very difficult to pick out almost any natural features in there other than the slope of the hill and occasional tree. And of course, we've got the building materials in there that we were talking about earlier on, of bricks and clay tiles. But I'm more interested in what's going on under those slopes. Whereas the standard geology map still surprises me that whenever I go out on a history walk around Brighton and I unfold a geology map and people just stare at it, where'd you get that from? What's that? How come geology maps aren't better known? I know they're expensive, to buy them over the counter, if you can find somewhere to sell them, but they are so useful in all manner of historical work. So Brighton has got this wonderful landscape of the chalk with these huge dry valleys that I mentioned earlier on, to the northwest and the northeast and the southwest. It's all right with geographer. We've got the Woolwich and Reading beds, giving us the area around University of Falmouth and down on the hills down towards Hove. We've got patches of clayey flints on the hilltops over here, north end of Hove, up here near where I live in Hollingbury, in the Stanmer Great Woods and over towards Rottingdean. And we've got a foreshore down here of storm gravels running along. So there's a lot of geology there if you can peel away the layers of housing. Of course, some of it is relatively easy. You walk around and you look. This is out behind the old Kent Town station, near the Kent Town tunnel. The railway closed in 1967, and it's currently the tunnel's used for storage purposes. But you've got some wonderful chalk here, and of course we've got the flint in here, which we've just been hearing so marvellously exposition on. If you go down onto the foreshore, you actually can get a glimpse of the chalk platform that underlies the whole of the coastline running along. Most people wanting to see the chalk platform go over to Ovendene, Rottingdean, Saltdean and Points East. Don't think of it as occurring off of Brighton. A couple of occasions I've been down on Hove Beach, and this is at Kent Town, and on very low tides, particularly with an easterly wind, seems to move the shingle away, and you get an exposure of the chalk platform that lies deep down under Brighton. So it's there to be seen, putting it together. Okay. I do a lot of work using historical maps, and this is the 1788 Budgeon's map of Brighton, and we've got North Street coming away up here. We've got the footway to Hove running along here. It's the Western Road, you see. But up here, opposite St Nicholas Church, which is still a great feature in the landscape, we've got the chalk pit. Now that is a sizable chalk pit in 1788. It runs up the area of the southern end of Dyke, we now term Dyke Road, running down here, and there is a little entrance into the chalk pit, and that was functioning for builders' lime, for burning for lime, also being used for agricultural purposes roundabout, and it grew extensively throughout the 18th century, particularly with Brighton's big building boom and requiring a great deal of lime mortar and lime plaster, stucco for some of the more elegant buildings, and it survived right the way through into the period, really into the 1930s, functioning as an industrial site, because what this is being used for is for lime production and for raw chalk. As it gets bigger, it gets used as a rope walk, it gets used as a storage space on the edge of town. It's still there if you go along that southern end of the footpath leading up to the church. You can see in here there's a big hollow running into the hillside. If you go behind here and go down along the Western Road, well, you can start to look back up, and in the 19th century, before a lot of the building took place, Western Road was built up in about the 1830s. So before the 1830s, looking from down here, looking across, there is the chalk pit. We've got the coach going up the hill towards up the Dyke Road, running away here. We've got a little cabin cut into the chalk pit. We've got someone's washing hanging out here, rather nice. And that was still there as a noticeable feature. Up until the 1930s, there was a blacksmith's located at the entrance to the chalk pit that was still functioning up until 1939. And there was a whole series of warehouses and workshops in there. So right on the edge of commercial Brighton, behind the big elegant stores at Western Road, have this little industrial site. But we've got this, and I'm indebted to John Cooper for providing me with this really beautiful watercolour. And you can see what a sizable hole that is that's been dug out. There used to be a lovely story told of someone who lived in the chalk pit, Corporal Staines, who lost both his legs at the Battle of Waterloo, and he used to carve things out of the chalk and sell them as ornaments to to passers-by. So rather nice, the kind of Brighton souvenir shop up there. It's a 1932 picture of the beautiful buildings which lined the northern side of Western Road. So it's the area facing across to Churchill Square, and this is the building when they were knocking these buildings down, built in the 1830s, to construct the big stores that run along the north side of Western Road. Now, Western Road was very narrow up until the 20s, and traffic congestion was impossible, so they decided to knock down the north side of Western Road and push the building line back. And they revealed the original houses, which had late 19th century shops built in the front garden. But as part of the demolition, and this becomes Marks and Spencer's, you can see here, it's a lovely line of involutions running along here because we're on the solid chalk. If we just kind of go back to that view, roughly the line of Western Road is showing you roughly the line of the old sea cliff. So if you're in Marks and Spencer's, you're on the edge of the chalk. If you dangerously cross the road to Churchill Square, you're out on the Coombe deposits, the head deposits. So that's what we've got there. We've got the solid chalk, and there are the involutions running along the surface while they're demolishing those buildings. So that evidence is there. It's just finding these historic materials. Very fortunate now that we've got the East Sussex records, the Brighton Hove records, and the University of Sussex records all in one magnificent building at the Keep. If you haven't visited the Keep archive, do so, because there's a massive information there. Of course, most of us are familiar with this view. Want to see what's underneath Brighton, you go to underneath Churchill Square shopping precinct. For them to build that huge hole down in there is out at Black Rock. Quite why they were allowed to build as the right opposite the classic junction, which is in all the geology books no one knows. But we've got this great view here of the head deposits that underlie everything from this point running westwards right the way down through the Sussex coast, and it's very difficult to see them apart from this one spot at Black Rock, because almost immediately west of here the whole of the seafront has been cemented and concreted over, and then that cliff line disappears under the built environment running westwards from Brighton and down you know, along the line of the A27, essentially. If we follow that cliff line westwards, brings us into this lovely historic map of 1783. Now, those of you who've dealt with historic maps will know it's notoriously difficult getting dates on maps. You know, map cartographers very carefully hide dates away, because the moment you put a date on a map, it's out of date. So they hide it away everywhere. This is wonderful because this is dated the 1st of May 1773. How do we know this? Because it's been drawn on the back of a personal letter. And I'm sure we've all been on holiday and you bought a postcard of the resort you're in, you know, Benidorm or somewhere. You know, high-rise block, X next to where you're living, you know, send it back. Perhaps you don't, you're too middle class. But I live in Brighton, so I'm not. This was drawn by a military surveyor who came to Brighton. So he drew his own map of Brighton on the 1st of May, 1773. This is over in the Keep. Don't try and read this writing. The writing is upside down. We have a convention in geography, mostly 19th century onwards, of the north goes at the top of the map and the south goes at the bottom. That's not always, it's not universal, and it's certainly not historically correct. So this map was drawn, as it were, upside down. And I've turned it around the way we would recognise it. So we've got the Steine over here. We've got the, you know, the grid of Brighton streets. This is just before Brighton bursts out. We've got the cliff line running in here, roughly where the aquarium is, Madeira Drive and Marine Parade up here. And then we run along the beach here. We've got the East Battery at the bottom of East Street, which has got some sea defences. We've got some groining here, protected, but interestingly, we've got that half donut there. And that is facing across the beach to what were drawn in red on the original plan. And it says in the writing here, which of course is upside down, streets of the town now disappeared under the sea. Now, this is the lower town of Brighton, which would have disappeared at the end of the 17th century. So he couldn't possibly have known that, wouldn't have met anybody who would have actually have seen that. That's a long time before he would have been visiting, the surveyor would have been visiting. But it was obviously in the public domain that there were streets down there. But what we've got left is that. And that is the remnants of the blockhouse. There's the blockhouse. And the blockhouse was on the highest point of Brighton seafront, which is, if you stand on the Palace Pier and look across at Brighton, it drops very sharply down to Poole Valley, goes up to a high point opposite the Old Ship Hotel, and then runs away very gently down towards the Hove border where the top and lower promenades meet. This is the end of the Dyke Road Bridge. You come from the Devil's Dyke, you run down the Dyke Road, 7 dials, down past St Nicholas Church that we saw on one of the earlier slides, and then disappears underneath built Brighton. But that's the end of the Dyke Road Bridge, and they put the blockhouse there as a defence during the scare for the Spanish Armada. Of course, like most British defence policy, but in the wrong place at the wrong time. Never fired a shot in anger. The only time they fired the guns from there, a French privateer came in very close to the coastline, chased by a Navy frigate. They ran the guns out, they fired the guns, missed the Frenchman, hit the Navy frigate. A few weeks later, officials came down from the Tower of London and made them give up their guns. And they were taken away back to the tower, and eventually this collapsed, as you can see, go back there, it's there. That's 1773, this is dated 1769, so they're almost contemporary. You can see some rudimentary shore defence works going there. And look, we're not looking at white chalk here, are we? This is the head deposits, the Coombe deposits, on a kind of 20-foot high cliff here. Now, if you look at maps, you sometimes get clues from place names. Earlier on, we were talking about the den names that, you know, the Kentish Weald, and that goes into the fields of mid-Sussex and the folds of Surrey, so you can use place name evidence. But if you go from the old town of Brighton, you run along Marine Parade here, you come to Lower Rock Gardens, which leads to Upper Rock Gardens. Now that's not a common name, and you would think it must have applied to something, but there's nothing in the landscape today. But if you go back to an earlier print, here we are, 1809, the Old Rocks at Brighton. And that's roughly opposite the New Steine area of Brighton. So you've got the New Steine here, and here's Rock Garden. These rocks were here, and the reason they were not there today is they were blown up in the 1820s, because off of New Steine was where they built the chain pier. Now that's not the line of the chain pier, it's almost the line of the chain pier. So golden chain pier is gone. If you stand on the beach, so you've got the open space of the new steam, that's the chain pier, and those rocks were just adjacent to it, and they were removed. They thought to be dangerous when they were building the pier. So they've gone. Now, what were those rocks? Well, if you go over to Hove Gap and you look at some of the concretions which have fallen over the cliff, these recalcified bands of flint which have toppled over down into Hove Gap. I was talking to John Cooper a few years ago about this, and he thinks that the old rocks at Brighton may very well have been the same here, which are sometimes classified as, that strange term, older head. And if you look on the geology maps, the only bit that we've got surviving the current landscape is at the back of Saltdean, up here, Saltdean, Portslade area, where we've got that symbol, which is the symbol for the older head deposits. Okay, so there must have been a way down there, away to the westward. So you can fit these bits of jigsaw. It's like doing a jigsaw when you haven't got the lid, and you've got other bits from other jigsaw in the box as well. Bit difficult. Now this is a bit more straightforward. It's a view of Brighton in 1765, when, always like this picture, it puts that lie to, quotes, the Prince Regent comes to Brighton and finds a deserted fishing village and turns it into a resort overnight. This is 20 years before the Prince Regent comes to Brighton. It's a pretty sizable town, and we've got some gentry down here. Showing you this, we've got a nice view of the Steam running along here. And the Steam is that valley, which is about 12 to 13 metres thick, with the head deposits in the bottom of the dry valley. And you would think, bottom of a dry valley, this is chalk, this is chalk, it's a chalky soil down here. Now, if you go adjacent to just here, there's a building which is a barn, which is the nucleus of the much later, 20, 30 years later, the Royal Pavilion. So this is the Royal Pavilion. Now, this is me as volunteer gardener at the Royal Pavilion, Tuesday lady, the Tuesday ladies and Friday ladies. There are now some men on a Friday, but they are honorary Friday ladies. It's Brighton, we like to keep these things in. So, if you look at the geology maps and you see a valley in chalk head deposits, chalk coombe head deposits, you would assume it's chalky soil down here. But don't always believe the evidence of geology maps. Robert Hill Snoop, the gardener, has been the head gardener here for 20 years. He spends 5 days, sometimes 6 days a week in these gardens working on the soil. He was interviewed for a Radio 4 programme about the gardens a couple of years ago, and he described them as a light sandy loam. Yeah? Am I going to believe the geology map or the man who spent 20 years, 5 days a week working on it? Robert said it's a light sandy loam. It's a light sandy loam. And it is a very, very hungry soil. Water just passes straight through it. So if you think, where is that coming from? If we go on to the geology map, here we've got the Woolwich Reading beds on the Seven Dials area running across to St Answell Park, and that is running down the slope. Look, there's that Dyke Road Bridge running down there to there. That's where the blockhouse was, yeah? Right at the end of the ridge. Okay? So that material is flowing down, and it's filling up the valley here with this soil. And it's still, thousands of years later, it's still a sandy soil. Now, one of the features of downland valleys, much discussed by geographers and still not fully understood, is that downland valleys are asymmetric. They are not equal-sided. You will get one shallow side and one steep side. If you look at this nice print, 1850s Brighton, taken from where I took the first image, so we're up on the Albion Hill east of Brighton, looking across a relatively gentle slope of the North Lane, okay? Trafalgar Street running up here to the station. There's the cutting we saw a picture of earlier on. And this gentle, low-lying slope ensures that it's going to be covered in industry. It's easy to move big goods and cargoes around on a gentle slope. Okay? But if you come to the other side of the valley, where I'm taking the picture from, it's still Albion Hill. You need yaks and oxygen and crampons to get up there. And a classic Argus picture, every kind of time, snowy weather, icy weather, there's always some cart on its side sliding down Albion Hill. It's a very, very steep slope. If you just go back to that image, it also influences how the social geography of the town has developed, because these gentle slopes developed as an industrial quarter, but in the late 20th century, they undergo that wonderful social geography process of gentrification. 40 years ago, 50 years ago, they were going to stick a huge highway through the middle of all this. Now it is much sought after North Lake. Okay? If you go to the eastern side of the valley, it's still a poorer working class neighbourhood. Okay? It's still Brighton, so it's not that cheap. but you know, there's an east end and a west end to that. If we go and look a bit further along the other side of the city, now I was born in Brighton, so to me, you know, Brighton and Hove is fine. Anyone born out in Hove here hates the idea that it's the city of Brighton and Hove. You know, they would cut their throats rather than say Brighton and Hove. You know. But on this 1813 first edition Ordnance Survey, we've got Week Farm over here, Wick Farm. Some little symbols down here. These are the brick fields working the brick earth, the low Essex deposits along the coast. Okay? And the big, notice these big square fields, we're going to come back to those a bit later. The downs just to the north here, this is the coastal plain widening out from Brighton. Okay? If you look along here, you can see Wick Farm is there. It's on these Woolwich and Reading beds. And that is a kind of acidic deposit. That gives you the mineral springs that bubbled up there. These are the original spa springs that people came to Brighton Elmstone then to take the waters. You either took the waters at the sea or you went to the spring here, St Anne's Well. And those acidic waters and the acid soils give rise to a big patch of gorse, also known as furze. And so the flats there, built in 1936, are Furze Croft. Okay? So you've got these place names, you know, going way back that kind of link you back into the landscape, into the geology. You know, kind of classic 1930s, straight out of Poirot film. Okay. Well, away to the west of Brighton, you've got big patches here of the low Essex brick earths out here in the New Church Road area of Hove, which made bricks until the 1920s. And then further out here in Portslade, Southwick and Shoreham, tiny patch here from the Grand Avenue in Hove. Now, I didn't put it in this sequence because to keep the time down. I've got at home an 1881 map showing you the geology of Brighton for a health report. And that shows the brick earth as extending right down to the bottom of West Street as a kind of big wedge. Now, of course, urban development has stripped away a lot of that brick earth, or it's just not visible because of the building, but it looks very patchy here. But 130 odd years ago, 140 years ago, it's showing you, the map showing you much more brick earth here. Now, of course, you can't see the brick earth covered in houses. So I've skipped over to West Sussex, somewhere to the edge of the A27, looking up to the Downs, and this is the area of the brick earth lying along that West Sussex coastal plain. Grade 1 soil. You know, this is the best land. Talking about agricultural classifications, you go from 5 in the top of Ashdown Forest, you know, and the heathlands, some of the heathlands of West Sussex, and 1 being here. You know, this is the soil that if you were going to buy it retail, you'd have to go to Waitrose to buy it. You know, this is Waitrose grade soil. But this is what Hove looked like, you know, before the housing. You can still see patches of it. It's a building site, a big block of flats being built opposite King Alfred on Hove seafront, and poke head through the fence here, and there's the lovely dark, rich red of the brick earth soils there, which gave rise to all of that, those brick fields running away. Now, this is the Materia Map of Brighton. Materia meaning a land holdings map, and it shows you the old lanes. This is always confusion in Brighton. This area correctly is the old town. In the 19th century it becomes known as the lanes, meaning tiny twigs and streets. It's surrounded with lanes, L-A-I-N-E, meaning a big open field. It's an Anglo-Saxon Germanic word. And Brighton in 1792, when this map was produced, still had these great big areas of strip fields, which have been completely gone from most of southern Britain. They start to disappear. The first ones we know enclosures in Sussex are at Westburton or West Burton, over to the north of Arundel, over towards Fittleworth that way. 1453. They're still surviving in fragments in the 19th century in places like Plumpton. But in 1792, almost the whole of Brighton has still got this kind of Anglo-Saxon strip fields. Brighton was a maritime town. It looked to the sea, it didn't look to the land. The only other major town on the south coast which has a field layout like that is Portsmouth. And Portsmouth is a maritime navy town. We're a coastal trading town. And it reflects Brighton's road networks. If you put a street map of Brighton over that, that's the street network, okay? Except here, in the west of the town, very, very few of those thick fields. There's a reason for this. That's the area of the brick earth. That's the area of the very gentle slopes running westward from the western side of Brighton, covered in brick earth. Brick earth, remember, is that. It's grade 1, it's rich. So you're all sitting down, I'm glad of this because you might faint for shock. Rich people buy expensive land. Okay? So this is all owned by very, very few landowners. If you get the land ownership pattern with this, in the 1790s, this is the North Lane area, very shishy area of Brighton today, but 4 big landowners own 37% of that in the end of the 18th century. The same 4 owners own 90% of the West Lane. And sometime in the 1770s, they appear to amalgamate their strips together, divvy up their strips, so each one of them got big fields. There's a bit of buying and selling going on. So you don't end up with this tiny, minute strips of land ownership. You end up with big, modern, square, rectangular fields. And you see that reflected as Brighton develops westward over into Hove. So that's where Brunswick Square is, and Bedford Square, and Norfolk Square, and Clown Square, and Russell Square, and Regency Square. Those are the big rectangular blocks. You can put houses around the outside, and they're big rectangular blocks because the soil is good, single landowner, and he's updated his agriculture. So you know, the very fact that you've got this rich geology influences the land ownership, influences the later urban development. If you go into Bedford Square, the top end of Bedford Square, beautiful kind of early, about 1810, Brighton bow fronts, lovely hooded balconies. All the houses in this end of Brighton and running over into Hove, they all have lovely deep basements. Lovely deep basements because that brick earth was used for, guess what, making bricks. So there's big holes in the ground. When you strip out the brick earth, you take away the best soil, you then build into the brick pits. So all these properties have big basements. Back in my teenage years, most of these basements were very, very dodgy nightclubs. If we go away from the southwestern side of Brighton over to the northeastern side, over here towards the Falmer area, so just coming to the edge of the city of Brighton and Hove, around the University of Sussex. I started going there in 1980 as a student, and you could walk from Falmer Station to the university through fields of cabbages and cauliflowers. And all on the eastern side of the university were huge fields of sprouts and cabbages. That's all gone now. That's all gone completely. It's just been built over. But if you look here, is where the patches of Woolwich and Reading beds are. That's the reason for Falmer Pond being there. But there's a nice source you can use, which is the building of Stanmer House. And Stanmer up here, Stanmer House, we've got the accounts at the keep from the 1720s, very detailed accounts. And one of the sources of material was John Bradford of Falmer in 1722, 160 cartloads of red pit sand from Falmer to Stanmer at 1 9d a load, £14. Okay? And all the way down through here, 350, 35 loads here, £3, 1 3d. Yeah? So this is red pit sand. There's the red pit sand. That's Falmer. Can I take that picture? No, no. That's the Amex Stadium now. This is when they stripped away the topsoil to build the Amex Stadium. It happened to be there when some archaeologists were working over it, and so that's the red pit sand that was being used to build Stanmer House. If you go to the north of Brighton, going out Brighton through Patcham, up the A23, to the north there's a little valley called Standine, which is in that lovely piece of wild downland between Ditchley Beacon and Patcham. Standing meaning, as indeed Old Steam does and Stanmer does, Stony Valley. Anglo-Saxon, Stony Valley. And there's one of the Sarsen boulders, which you see there. Now, archaeologists amongst you will know of Rocky Clump in Stanmer Park, which is Brighton Hove Archaeological Society been working on for years and years. And there you can just still see trees growing with their roots around the Sarsen boulders that are in situ. Most Sarsen boulders you see have been physically moved by human agents. We go right from that end, northern end, right over to the far side of the western side of the Conurbation, or western, not Conurbation, but western side of the city, over to Portslade by sea. We've got the canal running in here part on the course of the old River Ada course. Lock gates built in the 1850s stopped this being tidal. Before it was tidal, they used to collect rock from the foreshore, and they used to collect stuff called copperas. And it gives us the name here, the old name for Portslade by Sea, of Copperas Gap. Now, some things don't get better, do they? In local, this has been Copperas Gap since about 1690 to 1974. And with the local government reorganisation in 1974, they changed this area, it's in the parish of Portslade, to Portslade South. Now, to my mind, you cannot say Copperas Gap without thinking you're in a pirate film. Copperas Gap, Portslade South. It doesn't sound the same. That's Johnny Depp saying Portslade South. So, Robert Newton for anyone older here. So we've got Copperas here. Now, this is interesting because Copperas is ferrous bisulfate. It's a rock that's found in the London clay, so you find it on the North Kent coast, around the Isle of Sheppey, Sittingbourne, that area. You find it on the Essex shore, running up towards Clacton. It was collected, it was taken up to Faversham in Kent, it was put into bowls of rainwater, it very gently dissolved, that was boiled up, and it went on to the what becomes ICI at Faversham. It's a very weak form of sulphur used in chemical processes. This didn't happen down here, but it was collected along from the London clay. That is one of the reasons the canal is there, is the London clay. Now, on that geology map, there's no indication that London clay is there. On the more recent geology map, there's no indication there's London clay there. But very nice old gentleman who was part of the Brighton Geological Society told me that when he was a boy, around about the time of the First World War, he used to play over here. He lived in Southwick. And he used to play over here where the power stations now are. All this is indicating it's man-made landscape. But there were huge holes in the beach where they dug the foundations out to make big mystery towers, which were supposed to stop the submarines coming up the channel in the First World War. The mystery towers there for a long time. They dug huge holes to get the materials out. And he said all this was like a big blue plasticine bowl. You would get in and you'd get buckets of this kind of blue plasticine clay out. And that is the London clay, which isn't indicated on the ticket. Again, getting people's verbal, oral histories can be sometimes important. Okay, that's Copperas. You'll wonder what Copperas is. It's very dense, very heavy. This piece obviously didn't come from Portslade, so I'm going to dive under the canal, but this came from Bognor Beach. Bognor was a great area for collecting this. It's a Copperas point round in Chichester Harbour. Okay? Still got a nice link there. I'm a historical geographer and we deal with continuity and change. Old students are groaning, even as I say this. Every landscape has continuity. Stop it, Tony. Every landscape has change. And we're here at Copperas Gap, which got its name from marine minerals. And what do they do now? They bring in marine minerals. So we've got that link into the past. Okay? Going back to that same page from the Stammer accounts, we've also got here Richard Spicer, Lettice King, lady's name, Jean Denat, Frenchman, sand gatherers at Brighthelmstone, and 391 cartloads of coarse sea sand, 6p per load, 218 cartloads of fine sea sand at 8p a load. Go down to the beach, the fine sea sand, taken at the water's edge, was 8p a load. The coarser material, with the gravel in it, was 6p a load. And if you look at those, go back to those accounts, they're actually dated November 1722, so you're digging wet sand on Brighton Beach before the inventions of Wellingtons. Yeah? And one of those people digging is a lady, someone I wouldn't argue with. Okay? So when you look at urban systems, it's sometimes very difficult to anticipate that there is geology there to see. It's there, it's hidden. You have to use clues, photographs, documents, oral histories, personal testimonies, and piece it together. But there's as much geology there as if we were out at the high wheel or underneath all these chalk cliffs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Geoffrey. Oh, that's what's under Brighton, I wondered. Any questions for Geoffrey? We've got a few minutes or so. Yeah, Matt.
Yeah, I've got a question. It's a bit softer than the rest of the rocks you're talking about. What about the Wall Valley? Has any kind of alluvium relating to the point been exposed or photos of things or pictures?
Can you repeat the question, please?
What's underneath Poole Valley? Poole Valley is the derelict bus station. Brighton has had for donkey's years. Poole Valley is the seaward end of the Wellsbourne stream, which is a stream that develops out of Patcham, has created Big London Road Valley, runs out through the Coombe Deposits cliff and creates a small cutting in the cliff, which was there until the 1820s when they built the coastal highway, blocked off that area as an actual entrance for small shipping or boats, and it became at the lowest point of Brighton. As far as I know, no one's dug down under there, but it should just basically be silt and Coombe deposits and some beach material, because it was a small inlet to the sea. It's the scene of a great tragedy in 1852. There was a huge violent summer thunderstorm. July the 17th, I think it was, I remember it well, it's 1852, and Brighton was so heavily built up, the rain fell on the roofs, onto the slate, onto the paved roads, straight down into the Central Valley, straight down to the lowest point of Brighton, which was Poole Valley, which, because it was too low for habitation, was used for stables. And so the horses drowned in their stables, and for weeks after, for July, August, hot, humid weather, they had to dig out from silt all this accumulated refuse and muck and excrement to roll down the hills of Brighton into Poole Valley and then unearth it all. So there's a lot of interesting things in Poole Valley if you want to dig amongst it.
Right, thank you very much.